Hello, thank you for joining us today. My name is Andy Sanford. I'm a transaction services partner here at Blick Rothenberg, and I'm delighted to be joined by Rob Goodley, tax partner again here at Blick Rothenberg, and Lee Humble, corporate finance partner at Assets. Today we're going to be talking about the effective sale of a business. So Rob, imagine the situation. You've got a client that gets phoned up by a prospective buyer, cold call. What should they do?
Well, there's some real commercial risks, which I'm sure Lee will come on to, but I guess from a tax perspective, to go forward with a cold call transaction is a high risk strategy. So I guess there's kind of two elements of that from a tax perspective. First, there's kind of tax risk in the business. Any sophisticated buyer is going to come in and do a really thorough due diligence. If you think about selling your house, it's not going to be a case of someone walking around for 5 minutes. They're going to be looking under the sofa cushions and probably under the carpets as well. And if you don't know what's there, there could be some real risks that you haven't covered off. And then kind of from a seller's perspective, their own tax perspective, you've then got basically no opportunity to implement any tax planning. Tax is normally the biggest cost on a transaction, so you could be walking into like a really tax inefficient deal. Okay, and Lee, what are your thoughts on that?
I think with any approach, obviously it's flattering for the vendor just to receive that phone call. I think key for me is just catching your breath and asking some questions. So fundamentally, are you in a place where you can sell? Do you want to sell? Do you know how much you want to sell for? And is that price reflective of the market? Similarly, if you've had a cold call, I'd be asking who the prospective party is. Do you know them? Do you know why they want you? Do they have the means to buy? Have they bought before? So there's just lots of questions which you've got to instantly ask yourself, and also crucially seek advice. Speak to those who've done it before.
I think it's also important to protect your business by getting an NDA signed and not give too much information away once that initial call is made.
Indeed, definitely.
Okay. Moving on slightly, what helps make a business sell well? So you're in a process, you want to sell the business. How do you maximise the value?
Yeah, preparation. A sales process is not quick. These days we tend to talk about transactions taking 6 to 12 months, but actually there's probably a period before which could stretch 2 years. So again, it's just being diligence ready. Do you have all of your information in one place? Is that information robust? Is it timely? Is it accurate? Are there any skeletons in the closet which you need to make people aware of soon in the process, but also balancing the kind of commercial sensitivity of what you do and what sits in the business? So for me, it's just preparation, it's thinking ahead, it's putting yourself in a buyer and their funder's shoes. So what are they going to look for? What are the risk points in your business in a transaction? And therefore, how can that party mitigate those risks?
And Rob, really from a tax perspective, what's your view on that?
Yeah, I think there's common themes here across the kind of the commercial piece, tax and legal. From a tax perspective, ideally I'm saying to clients you should be preparing more than 2 years in advance. And the reason for that is primarily there's some specific reliefs and exemptions which come up a lot on transactions, and they have a time element which can be 2 years. So if you're planning within that 2 year time frame, you've kind of lost some of the universe of tax plans that you could have implemented. Also kind of with the client base that we often work with, the entrepreneurial client base, normally they're not selling something which is already packaged up quite nicely already. There could be some non-core assets in there which a buyer doesn't want, say an investment property or a portfolio, or maybe even a sideline business which you as the entrepreneur really love and think will fly, but the buyer's not going to be interested in. Generally speaking, from a tax perspective, with time, we can carve those things out, normally tax neutrally, such that you're presenting something to the buyer which is nice and clean and saleable. Yeah. If you're trying to do that at the last minute as part of a transaction, it becomes really complicated and often costly. Yeah. I'd say the other element to it is you don't want to be taking a business through a sale process with kind of open tax risks. If you can mitigate them or close them down in advance, it really helps, because you'll lose a lot of value otherwise. So if you just put a little bit of effort in, 2-3 years in advance to say, these, for my type of business, the big risk areas are going to be VAT or payroll or whatever. Let's get a professional in and just kind of risk assess, and if there's a problem, fix it. Yeah. And then you're taking something nice and clean to a buyer.
I also think that the buyers during that process are going to be so mentally drained that if they have all these things that are going at them at the same time, it really just affects them and actually can affect the deal. Yeah. And I've seen situations where sellers have just walked away.
Yeah, I think it's a great point in terms of speed. A transaction is successful if it's quick. Get the issues on the table, strike a commercial agreement on the headlines as soon as you can, and then at that point just execute. Get it done, because the longer it drags, the bigger the risk that deal falls over.
I think entrepreneurs generally underestimate, which is fair enough, the amount of time that has to be put in. It's a job of itself, even with a great advisor group for that period.
And then moving on slightly, there's always the point that should the person who's selling the business actually appoint a corporate finance partner really to lead them through that process.
Yeah.
And Lee, I think I know what your answer will be on that, but it'd be interesting to help your views.
Most certainly, yeah. So advisors, quite often where you've got a matched buyer and seller, it may seem obvious that an advisor isn't needed. But actually, again, touching on Rob's point, we are experts in this field. So we know how to very quickly kind of push out anything which is disingenuous, but also crucially, how deliverable is the deal? So the parties in question, do they have the wherewithal? Are they asking the right questions? Are they disclosing certain things during the process which kind of guides you to the kind of key points of diligence, which again, if you can see that in advance, you can navigate and position the key elements in a way which is not going to, number one, erode value, or number two, destroy the deal. So for me, a good advisor should pay for themselves. The key for people like myself is getting them there soon enough to, number one, assess the lay of the land. If we step in too late where key commercial aspects are agreed, it can be quite hard for us to unpick, and that's obviously to no one's benefit.
And Rob, you've had practical experience of this.
Yes, I mean, Andy, we've both seen this before, and I think we always take a sharp intake of breath when we've got a deal without a corporate finance advisor. I think for two reasons, really, primarily for me. It's firstly, if you've got a good corporate finance provider, you have that confidence that the business is saleable. They've had an initial look, and anything obvious that needs fixing has been fixed. So you're not going to find some horrendous problems through the process. I think the second thing is that on most transactions, the buyer and seller are going to have to work together after the deal, even if it's just for a short period. And doing that after a negotiation where you've been negotiating head to head can be quite difficult because you might have had some really hard conversations. But if you have that corporate finance advisor in the middle, they can be the fall guy, they can have the bad conversations, and you can really maintain that relationship between buyer and seller. So I think it gives you a better outcome overall, even just from kind of a human perspective and running the business afterwards.
And I think beyond that as well, the one thing that I will point towards is, if you look at the structure of deals, in an environment where there's a lot of risk, conditional deals where some of the consideration is pushed into the future, there's a lot of risk there in terms of future payments. So making understand our client fully understands what triggers payment, what the risks are, and crucially what protection mechanisms can be inserted is key. And again, to Rob's point, it's better coming from us who are slightly detached, removed, and not as emotionally charged, given the transaction which is in the offing.
And of course, when heads of terms have been agreed, it's then often hard to actually row back if the corporate financer is brought in at the too later stage as well.
Absolutely.
I think as well, just to kind of final point on that, I think I hear a lot of entrepreneurs say, well, look, I'm making commercial decisions every day.
Yeah.
I can do this, and I know my business better than anybody else does. But actually having that, like Lee says, that cold pair of eyes externally, you might know the business really well, but you might not necessarily know the value of your business to somebody else. And actually you're taking valuable commercial decisions every day, sure, but how often have you sold a business? It's a completely different ballgame.
Obviously, one of the main reasons for selling a business is to have an exit and to generate a large amount of money. But for the buyer, that person exiting the business may be not what they want. So, Rob, how do those issues get addressed?
Yeah, well, I mean, succession of a management team or management of a business is always a key issue, especially for buyers. I mean, Lee can talk to this in a moment, I'm sure, but generally if an entrepreneur wants to step away from a business, they need to be able to convince a buyer that they've got a management team who can run it. And actually what I end up talking to a lot of my clients around who have aspirations to sell is, if these are your next guys and girls who are going to run the business, you should be giving them a stake in the business, an ownership stake. And you can structure it so that it's kind of if you like, it's a participation in future growth rather than today's value. Because you say, well, I've built that, now it's for you guys to build the next bit of value. Because while it's kind of good and right to motivate those people, and it's more likely you'll get a sale away, I think it also inspires confidence in the buyer to say, well, if you've had the confidence to give these guys a stake and they're really bought in and have skin in the game, then I'm happy about that.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, again, if you look at the risk of business failure post-transaction, it's the first 12 months post-deal, which is why for a buyer what they're looking for is continuity, consistency in the business. Whatever they've bought, they want it to continue. So there are examples where some owners may exit on completion, but that is the rarity. So for me, I'd look at it from an outgoing perspective. You know, what are my red lines? What am I prepared to offer in terms of a handover, a period, remuneration? Similarly with the deal structure, if you've got future consideration linked to performance, it might be that you want to stay around that little bit longer just to give the business the best chance of delivering against those targets.
And I think it's really important that the key personnel that you identify as the seller who's going to remain in the business are credible when they're in front of the buyer and can actually present and attract, making the business really attractive.
Yeah.
Because if they're a little bit limp, it's really hard to get around that with the buyer.
And again, it is something which is hard for business owners because, again, if there has been interest, sometimes they are reluctant to share that interest with their management team because they are nervous about, you know, departures. What if that manager does not want to stay in the business in the event that ownership changes? But again, what you don't want is to be seen to be too important to the business. You need to demonstrate resilience in your team, the fact that you've got others in the business, because that eases your exit. But also, crucially, you know, it gets the key people in front of the buyers straight away.
Well, Rob, final
I was
thoughts?
going to say, coming back to the point I made previously as well, is that, you know, it's a big process. You need a team around you. It's not going to be executable from your perspective if it's just you. Let alone the buyers thinking that there's too much key man risk. You know, you need a good team behind you.
Thank you, Lee and Rob. And if you'd like to learn more about selling a business, then please do not hesitate to contact either Rob, Lee or myself or your usual Blick Rothenberg partner or via the website.